A doctor slaps a black nurse not knowing her husband owns the hospital. Moments later, he is begging for mercy as karma catches up to him. Will this arrogant doctor finally face justice, or will his prejudice only drag him deeper into trouble? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The operating room hummed with the steady beep of monitors and the soft whir of medical equipment. Dr. Terry Harold stood at the operating table, his experienced hands moving with practiced precision as he performed gallbladder surgery on the elderly patient before him. His reputation had preceded him at Memorial Hospital, where he joined after serving 20 years as a doctor in another town. The operating room doors swooshed open, and Martha Brown, one of the hospital's most capable nurses, entered the sterile environment. Her dark skin contrasted against the crisp blue surgical scrubs as she approached the operating table with quiet confidence. She had been called in to assist when another nurse had to leave due to a family emergency. "I'm here to help, Dr. Harold," Martha said professionally, her voice clear despite the surgical mask covering her face. "I've been briefed on the procedure." Terry barely glanced up from his work, his shoulders tensing slightly at her presence. "Fine. Monitor his vitals and stand ready to assist." Martha moved efficiently around the operating table, her eyes scanning the monitors while maintaining awareness of the doctor's needs. The surgery progressed smoothly, with Martha anticipating and responding to each step of the procedure. "Clamp," Terry commanded, holding out his gloved hand. Martha reached for the instrument tray, selecting the appropriate clamp with practiced ease. As she extended her arm to hand it to him, her elbow brushed against his sleeve ever so slightly. Terry jerked away as if burned, nearly dropping the instrument. His eyes flashed with anger behind his surgical glasses. "Keep your distance," he snapped, his voice sharp and cutting in the quiet operating room. "I don't need you contaminating my sterile field. Stand at least 3 feet back unless absolutely necessary." The other operating room staff froze momentarily, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a scalpel. Martha's hands stilled for just a second, the only indication that his words had affected her. 20 years of nursing experience had taught her how to maintain her composure, even when faced with such blatant disrespect. "Yes, doctor," she replied evenly, taking a step back. Her voice remained steady, professional, though her heart ached with the familiar pain of discrimination. She had encountered prejudice before, but it never hurt any less. The surgery continued in uncomfortable silence, with Martha maintaining her distance while still performing her duties flawlessly. She kept her movements precise and efficient, careful to stay exactly 3 feet away unless absolutely necessary. Her vital sign updates were clear but brief, spoken across the artificial distance Terry had created. Through it all, Martha's dark eyes remained focused and alert, her attention never wavering from the patient's needs. She had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence, and she wouldn't let Terry's behavior compromise her standard of care. Terry continued operating, his movements slightly more rigid than before, as if Martha's very presence made him uncomfortable. He barked out commands rather than speaking normally, each word tinged with barely concealed disdain. When he needed instruments, he would hold his hand out behind him, expecting them to be placed there without any contact. The other staff members in the operating room exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke up. The soft beeping of monitors and the clink of surgical instruments filled the awkward silence that had descended upon the room. Martha's feet ached from standing, and her back was stiff from maintaining the unnatural distance while trying to assist effectively. But her movements remained graceful, and her manner professional. She refused to let Terry's prejudice affect her performance or her dignity. Instead, she focused on the unconscious patient on the table, reminding herself that his care was what truly mattered. When the final stitch was placed, Martha stepped back to her designated distance, her heart heavy, but her head held high. She had endured worse in her career, but this incident still stung. The fact that such prejudice could exist in a place of healing seemed particularly painful. As she watched Terry complete his final checks of the surgical site, Martha took slow, deep breaths, keeping her emotions in check. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his words had cut. After the surgery, Martha methodically completed her post-operative duties, documenting everything with her usual precision. The encounter with Dr. Harold weighed heavily on her mind, but she maintained her professional demeanor as she finished her tasks. Later that afternoon, Martha stood outside Dr. Harold's office taking a deep breath before knocking on the door. She needed to address what had happened in the operating room, not just for herself, but for the sake of future collaborations and patient care. "Come in," Terry's voice called out, sharp and irritated. Martha entered the office, noting how Terry barely looked up from his paperwork. His desk was meticulously organized, with medical journals stacked neatly to one side and his credentials prominently displayed on the wall behind him. "Dr. Harold," Martha began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I wanted to discuss what happened in the operating room earlier. Was there something specific about my assistance that concerned you? If I made any mistakes, I'd like to know so I can improve." Terry finally looked up, his face hardening as he regarded her. His pen clicked against the desk as he set it down with deliberate slowness. "Nurse Brown," he said, emphasizing her title with barely concealed contempt, "you would do well to simply follow instructions without questioning my authority. I don't owe you any explanations about how I run my operating room." Martha stood straighter, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from trembling, not from fear, but from the effort of maintaining her composure. "I understand the importance of authority in the OR, Doctor. I'm simply trying to ensure the best possible care for our patients through clear communication." "The best care for our patients," Terry interrupted, "is achieved when staff members know their place and follow orders without question. Is that clear?" Martha took another steady breath, recognizing that further discussion would be futile. "Very well, Dr. Harold. My shift is ending now, so I'll be heading home." She turned toward the door, her movements dignified despite the tension in her shoulders. But before she could take more than 2 steps, she felt Terry's hand grab her wrist, his grip uncomfortably tight. "You'll walk out when I say you can walk out," Terry growled, rising from his chair. His face had flushed red with anger, his authority challenged in a way he clearly couldn't tolerate. "I don't know what kind of hospital you think this is, but here, you follow my rules, my schedule, and my orders." Martha looked down at where his fingers wrapped around her wrist, then back up at his face. The fluorescent lights of the office cast harsh shadows across his features, highlighting the contempt in his expression. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the tense silence, marking each second of this power play that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with racism. Martha's eyes widened in shock as Terry's grip tightened around her wrist. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an unnatural pallor across the office. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she tried to process this sudden escalation. "Dr. Harold, please let go of my wrist," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain professional. She attempted to pull away, but his fingers only dug deeper into her skin. "I don't think you understand how things work here," Terry snarled, his face inches from hers. His breath came in sharp bursts, his normally controlled demeanor cracking to reveal the rage beneath. Martha twisted her arm, trying to break free from his grip. "This is completely inappropriate. Let me go right now, or I'll—" The sharp crack of his palm against her cheek echoed through the office. Martha's head snapped to the side, the sting of the slap burning across her face. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the lights, everything faded into a distant buzz as her mind struggled to process what had just happened. When reality crashed back in, Martha stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Without another word, she turned and fled from the office, her footsteps echoing down the sterile hospital corridor as she ran. Terry stood in his office, his hand still raised, watching her retreat. The initial flash of anger began to fade, replaced by a smug satisfaction. He straightened his white coat and walked back to his desk, adjusting the placement of his pen with precise movements. "What will this black nurse even do?" he muttered to himself, settling back into his chair. A dismissive smile played across his lips as he picked up his pen. "I'm a senior doctor, and she is just a nurse." He glanced at his credentials on the wall, his numerous achievements and accolades displayed in gleaming frames. The memory of Martha's shocked expression only reinforced his sense of superiority. The incident was already fading in his mind, becoming just another reminder of the natural order of things in his world. Ron, a ward boy, stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, his hand gripping the handle of his cleaning cart. He had witnessed the entire scene through the partially open door of Dr. Harold's office. The sound of the slap still rang in his ears as he watched Martha rush past him, her face streaked with tears. His heart raced as he heard footsteps approaching the door. Dr. Terry Harold emerged, his white coat pristine and his expression composed. The doctor stopped abruptly when he noticed Ron, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "How long have you been standing there?" Terry's voice was low and measured, but Ron could detect the underlying tension. Ron's throat felt dry. I was just doing my rounds, Dr. Harold." His fingers tightened around the cart handle, knuckles turning white. Terry's face remained neutral as he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. The fluorescent lights overhead cast strange shadows across his features as he held it out to Ron. "There's $1,000 in here," Terry said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "I trust you understand what that means." Ron stared at the envelope, his conscience warring with the unexpected offer. The money would help with his mother's medical bills, but the weight of what he'd witnessed pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Why?" Ron found himself asking even as his hand reached for the envelope. "Why did you do that to her?" Terry's lips curved into a cold smile. "Some people deserve this," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "They need to learn their place in the hierarchy. Surely you understand that?" Ron felt the envelope in his hand, the paper smooth against his skin. The words, "Some people deserve this," echoed in his mind, reminding him of similar phrases he'd heard throughout his life. He knew exactly what Terry meant, and it made his stomach turn. Terry straightened his tie, clearly considering the matter settled. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making his features appear more severe. His eyes held a warning as he looked at Ron one final time. Ron stood there, the envelope heavy in his hand, watching Terry's retreating figure. The weight of the money felt like lead, and the memory of Martha's tears burned in his mind. He had seen that kind of pain before, had felt it himself, and now he held in his hands the price of his silence. Ron's fingers tightened around the envelope as he looked up at Dr. Terry Harold, finding courage in his rising anger. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker with tension. "Is this because of race, Dr. Harold?" Ron's voice was quiet but firm. "Is that why you treated Nurse Martha that way?" Terry's face darkened, his previous composed demeanor cracking slightly. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his features as he took a step closer to Ron. "You're overstepping, ward boy. Take the money and forget what you saw." His voice dropped to a threatening whisper. "Unless you'd prefer to find yourself looking for new employment?" The threat hung heavy in the air between them. Ron felt the familiar sting of discrimination, one he'd experienced too many times before. His grip on the envelope loosened slightly as reality set in, the reality of bills to pay and a family to support. Terry's eyes narrowed, satisfaction crossing his face as he watched Ron's internal struggle. "That's what I thought," he said, straightening his white coat. "Now get back to work." With that, he turned and strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing against the sterile walls. Ron stood there for a moment longer, the envelope weighing heavily in his hand. The money inside could help his family, but the cost to his conscience felt unbearable. With slow, deliberate movements, he tucked the envelope into his pocket and began walking toward the nurse's break room area. The hallway seemed longer than usual as he made his way through the hospital's winding corridors. The usual bustle of hospital activity felt distant, muffled by his racing thoughts. He knew the route well. The nurses often gathered there after their shifts, sharing stories and unwinding from the day's stress. As he approached the area, his steps became more hesitant. Through the window in the door, he could see several nurses moving about the room, but Martha wasn't among them. The sound of quiet conversation drifted through the door, a stark contrast to the tense confrontation he'd just experienced. Ron paused outside the break room, his hand resting on the door handle. The envelope in his pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. He knew Martha would likely come here. It was where she always went after her shift. The thought of facing her, knowing what he'd witnessed and the money he'd accepted, made his stomach twist with shame. Ron pushed open the break room door, finding Martha sitting alone in a corner, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. Her usual warm presence seemed diminished, her shoulders tense as she stared at nothing in particular. "Nurse Martha?" Ron approached carefully, noting how she flinched slightly at the sound of his voice. "May I sit with you for a moment?" Martha nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glow over her face, highlighting the redness in her eyes. "I saw what happened," Ron said softly, leaning forward. "But there's something I don't understand. Dr. Harold is new here. Doesn't he know who your husband is?" Martha's eyes met his, a flash of understanding crossing her features. "I don't want to use my husband's position for justice. I should have stood up to him." Ron nodded, his voice dropping lower. "Even if he doesn't know, what he did was completely wrong. No one should be treated that way, especially not someone as respected as you." Martha's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "I've never wanted to use James's position for my own benefit," she said firmly. "That's not who I am. I've worked hard to earn my place here, and I want to handle this myself, the right way." Ron shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the envelope suddenly feeling heavier in his pocket. "There's something else you should know," he said, pulling out the envelope and placing it on the table between them. "Dr. Harold gave me this. $1,000 to keep quiet about what I saw." Martha's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the envelope, then back at Ron. Her expression hardened, but not with anger, with determination. "Thank you for telling me this, Ron," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "I'm going to handle this the cold and calculated way. I won't let emotion cloud my judgment, but—" She paused, meeting his eyes directly. "I might need your help later. Will you be there?" Ron didn't hesitate. "Of course, whatever you need." Martha nodded, standing up from the table. Her posture had changed. She stood straighter now, her chin lifted slightly. The vulnerability from moments ago had been replaced with quiet resolve. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the break room, leaving Ron sitting there with his thoughts and the envelope still on the table. A while later, Martha pulled into the circular driveway of their elegant colonial home, the gravel crunching under her car's tires. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. She sat in her car for a moment, gathering her thoughts before finally stepping out. Inside, James was in his home office reviewing hospital documents. He looked up as Martha entered, his warm smile quickly fading when he saw her expression. "Martha, what's wrong, honey?" She slowly sank into one of the leather chairs across from his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The spacious office, with its dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, suddenly felt too small. "Something happened at the hospital today," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her throat. She recounted everything: the surgery, Terry's behavior, the slap, and Ron's revelation about the bribe. James's face darkened with each word. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair. When Martha finished speaking, he stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "I'll destroy him," James said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I'll fire him first thing tomorrow morning and make sure he never works in another hospital again. We'll file a lawsuit for assault and discrimination. By the time I'm done with him, he won't even be able to get a job treating stuffed animals." Martha shook her head, rising to place a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "No, James. Wait." "Wait?" He turned to face her, confusion mixing with his anger. "Martha, he assaulted you. He tried to cover it up. He needs to face consequences." "And he will," Martha said firmly. "But firing him won't change who he is. It won't make him stop being racist. He'll just take his prejudices somewhere else, maybe to a place where he can hurt people who don't have the resources to fight back." James studied her face. "What are you thinking?" "Revenge is a dish best served cold," Martha said, her voice calm but determined. "I want to handle this my way. smart, and calculated. I want him to learn something from this, not just suffer consequences he can blame on others. James ran a hand through his hair, his protective instincts warring with his respect for his wife's wishes. Martha, I understand what you're saying, but I'm worried about your safety at the hospital. He's already shown he's capable of violence. I know, Martha nodded, but I have allies there. Ron's watching my back and I'll be careful. Trust me on this, James. Please. After a long moment, James pulled Martha into a tight embrace. Okay, he said softly. We'll do this your way, but promise me you'll be careful. And the moment you feel threatened, you'll let me know. I promise, Martha said, relaxing into his arms. Thank you for understanding. Later that evening, Martha sat in her home office, the desk lamp casting a warm glow across her face as she dialed Ron's number. Her fingers drummed lightly on the polished wooden desk while she waited for him to answer. Hello? Ron's voice came through after 3 rings. Ron, it's Martha, she said, keeping her voice low even though she was alone in the room. I need your help with something. Of course, Ron replied without hesitation. What do you need? Martha leaned forward in her chair. The security cameras in the corridor outside Terry's office, they would have captured him giving you that money, right? Yeah, they would have, Ron said, understanding dawning in his voice. There's a camera right above his office door. Sir, do you think you could get that footage? Martha asked. It would show everything that happened in that hallway. Ron was quiet for a moment before responding. Actually, I have a good friend in security, Mike. He owes me a favor. I can ask him to pull the footage from today. When do you think you could get it? I'll talk to him tonight. He's working the night shift. Should be able to get it to you first thing in the morning, Ron said. But Martha, what are you planning to do with it? Martha's lips curved into a small smile. Let's just say someone is about to learn a lesson now. All right, Ron said, curiosity evident in his voice. I'll get that footage for you. Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate your help with this. After ending the call, Martha sat back in her chair, feeling more in control than she had all day. She switched off the desk lamp and made her way to the master bedroom, where James was already in bed reading a medical journal. He looked up as she entered, setting the journal aside. Everything okay? Yes, Martha said, sliding under the covers beside him. Ron's going to get the security footage from today. We'll have it by morning. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders as she settled against him. You sure about this? More sure than ever, Martha replied, closing her eyes as exhaustion from the day's events finally caught up with her. James reached over and turned off the bedside lamp, the room falling into darkness. Get some rest, honey. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. Martha nodded, already drifting off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that her plan was starting to take shape. The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn breeze. Martha and James pulled up to the hospital in their sleek black Mercedes, parking in James's reserved spot near the entrance. As they walked through the hospital's automatic doors together, heads turned and whispers followed. Good morning, Mr. Brown, called out the receptionist, straightening up in her chair. Morning, sir, several staff members echoed as they passed. James nodded warmly to each greeting, his hand resting supportively on Martha's lower back as they made their way through the corridors. The usual bustle of the hospital seemed to pause momentarily as people noticed the owner's presence. It wasn't often that James Brown walked the halls of his own hospital. They approached Terry's office where Ron was already waiting with an envelope. He handed it to Martha with a knowing look before stepping away. Martha tucked it into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the security footage inside. You ready? James asked, his voice low and steady. Martha nodded, squaring her shoulders. Remember what we discussed. Let me handle this first. I'll be right here, James assured her, positioning himself just outside the door. Martha knocked on Terry's office door, her knuckles rapping firmly against the wood. Come in, Terry's voice called out. Martha entered, closing the door behind her. Terry looked up from his computer screen, his face darkening when he saw her. What are you doing here? He snapped, pushing his chair back. I thought I made myself clear yesterday. You certainly did, Martha replied calmly, standing her ground. Terry stood up, his face reddening. Listen here, you need to learn your place. I won't have some nurse questioning my authority, especially not what, Dr. Harold? Martha's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Terry moved around his desk, stepping closer to Martha. Especially not someone like you. You think just because you got away yesterday, you can come back here and… The door opened and James Brown stepped in, his presence filling the room. Terry's words died in his throat as he registered who had just entered. Someone like what, Dr. Harold? James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Please finish that thought. I'm very interested in hearing exactly what you mean. Terry's demeanor shifted instantly, his previous aggression melting into a nervous smile as he faced James Brown. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he tried to regain his composure. Mr. Brown, sir, Terry stammered, straightening his white coat. I'm actually glad you're here. I've been meaning to report a serious issue. His eyes darted between Martha and James, unaware of their relationship. James raised an eyebrow, maintaining his calm facade. Oh, please do tell me about this issue, Dr. Harold. Terry cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with his stethoscope. Well, sir, this nurse here… He gestured toward Martha with a shaking hand. She's been making inappropriate advances toward me for days now, trying to pursue a relationship with me. Martha's face remained composed, though her eyes reflected a mix of disgust and disbelief at his desperate lie. That's quite a serious accusation, James said, his voice measured and professional. He crossed his arms, looking every bit the concerned hospital owner. As you know, we take workplace harassment very seriously at this institution. Yes, exactly, Terry said, gaining false confidence from James's seemingly supportive tone. I've been trying to handle it professionally, sir. I've repeatedly told her that I'm married, but she persists. It's becoming quite uncomfortable. James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I see. And you have evidence to support these claims, Dr. Harold? The color drained from Terry's face as his eyes darted between Martha and James. Mr. Brown, I didn't expect… Clearly, James said, moving to stand beside Martha. You didn't expect a lot of things, did you? Like the fact that the nurse you assaulted yesterday is my wife? Terry's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He took an unconscious step backward, bumping into his desk. Surely, James continued, his voice growing cooler, someone as experienced as yourself would document such serious allegations? Perhaps some emails, witness statements, security footage? Terry's face paled as he realized the corner he'd backed himself into. His mouth went dry as he struggled to form words. Well, you see… You're mumbling, Dr. Harold, James observed, his tone sharp. For someone making such serious accusations, you seem rather uncertain of your facts. Terry's hands began to tremble as he gripped the edge of his desk harder. I meant to document everything, but I was trying to be professional about it first. His words tumbled out in a nervous jumble, each one making his situation worse. James took a step closer, his presence becoming more intimidating. So, you're telling me you have absolutely no proof to support these allegations against a member of our nursing staff? Terry's stammering grew worse as panic set in. I can… Maybe… There might be… I should have… The office fell into a heavy silence as Terry's voice trailed off into incoherent mumbling, his attempted deception crumbling around him. Martha stepped forward, her composure unwavering. Actually, Dr. Harold, we need to discuss what happened in this office yesterday afternoon. Terry's shock quickly transformed into defensive anger. I don't know what you're talking about. This is clearly some sort of setup. A setup? Martha reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I think the security footage might tell a different story. Terry's face twitched. What footage? You're bluffing. Martha pressed play on her phone and turned the screen toward Terry. The crystal-clear video showed the corridor outside his office, capturing the moment he handed Ron the envelope full of cash. This is just the beginning, Martha said, scrolling through the footage. There's more. The video continued, showing Terry grabbing Martha's arm and the subsequent slap that sent her running from his office. The sound echoed through the small room, making Terry flinch. That's been doctored, Terry sputtered, his voice rising in panic. Anyone could have edited that footage. Martha pressed a button on her phone, putting it on speaker. Ron, you're on speaker with Dr. Harold, myself, and Mr. Brown. Hello, Mrs. Brown. Ron's voice came through clearly. Dr. Harold, I want you to know that I'm ready to testify about everything I witnessed yesterday. The assault, the bribe you offered me to keep quiet, and your comments about Mrs. Brown deserving what happened because of her race. Terry slumped into his chair, his arrogance finally cracking. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he looked frantically between Martha and James. I can explain. I don't think there's anything to explain, Martha said firmly. The footage speaks for itself, and Ron's testimony only confirms what we can all see with our own eyes. Your actions weren't just racist and violent, James added, his voice cold with controlled anger. They were a complete violation of everything this hospital stands for, not to mention criminal assault. Terry's hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair. Please, my career, my reputation. You should have thought about that before you decided to assault my wife, James replied. Before you tried to bribe a witness. Before you attempted to lie your way out of it with false accusations. Martha stepped closer to Terry's desk, her presence now commanding the room. The very things you looked down on me for, my race, my position as a nurse, made you feel so superior that you thought you could treat me however you wanted. But you forgot something important. Character matters more than titles or position. The silence in the room was deafening as Terry sat there defeated, his carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice crumbling around him. James stood up straight, his authority filling the room. Dr. Harold, you're fired, effective immediately, and that's just the beginning of the consequences you'll face for your actions. Terry jumped up from his chair, his composure completely shattered. Please, Mr. Brown, I'll do anything. I'll apologize, take sensitivity training, whatever you want. What I want, James said as he pulled out his phone, is to call the police and report your assault on my wife. He dialed 911, his fingers steady and determined. Terry's face went ash white as James reported the incident. Martha watched silently, her hands clasped in front of her as her husband detailed the assault and mentioned the existence of video evidence. Within 15 minutes, 2 police officers arrived at Terry's office. They were professional and thorough, reviewing the security footage on Martha's phone and taking Ron's statement over the phone. Dr. Terry Harold, one of the officers said, pulling out handcuffs. You're under arrest for assault and attempted witness tampering. You have the right to remain silent. As the officer continued reading Terry his rights, the former doctor's shoulders slumped in defeat. Please, he begged, looking at Martha with desperate eyes. I have a family. This will ruin everything. You should have thought about that before you chose to act with such cruelty and prejudice, Martha replied calmly. The officers began leading Terry out of the office. He continued pleading as they walked through the corridor. I'm sorry. I'll make it right. Please, don't do this. Hospital staff stopped and stared as their former colleague was escorted out in handcuffs, his pleas echoing through the hallways. The same people who had witnessed his arrogance and superiority now watched his humiliating departure. Once Terry was gone, James turned to Martha, his stern expression melting into one of concern. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. I'm so sorry this happened to you, sweetheart. I should have been here to protect you. Martha returned his embrace, feeling the tension of the past 24 hours finally released from her shoulders. You're here now, she said softly. And more importantly, you trusted me to handle this my way. James pulled back slightly, looking into her eyes. I'm sorry you had to experience such hatred and violence in our own hospital. This should have been a safe place for you. Martha leaned into his embrace again, drawing comfort from his presence. The office was quiet now, a stark contrast to the chaos of moments before. Through the window, they could see the police car pulling away with Terry in the back seat, his medical career and reputation in shambles, all because he had chosen to act on his prejudices rather than his principles. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. James and Martha arrived at the police station just as the sun was beginning to warm the brick building's facade. The front desk officer recognized them immediately, having processed Terry's booking the previous day. "Mr. and Mrs. Brown," the officer greeted them professionally. "Detective Sanders is expecting you for your statements." They were led through the bustling station to a well-lit interview room, where a detective in a pressed shirt and tie waited with a notepad. The next hour passed methodically, as Martha recounted the events in detail: the surgery room incident, Terry's aggressive behavior in his office, and the slap that had changed everything. James provided his perspective as the hospital owner, emphasizing the severity of Terry's actions and his abuse of authority. Detective Sanders typed everything into his computer, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "The security footage and witness statement from Ron Williams are very helpful," he explained. "This should be a straightforward case." After completing their statements, Martha cleared her throat. "Would it be possible to speak with Dr. Harold?" The detective looked up from his notes, surprised. "He's in holding. Are you sure you want to do that?" "Yes," Martha said firmly. James squeezed her hand supportively, though concern flickered across his face. "Very well," Detective Sanders replied. "I'll have an officer escort you to the holding area." They followed a uniformed officer down a series of corridors, their footsteps echoing against the concrete floors. The holding area was stark and cold, with harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows. Terry sat on a metal bench in his cell, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, though they were now wrinkled and disheveled. His usual air of superiority had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like defeat. When he saw Martha and James approaching, he stood up quickly. "Martha, Mr. Brown," he began, his voice hoarse. "I didn't expect to see you here." "We came to give our statements," James replied coldly. Terry gripped the cell bars, his knuckles white. "I know what I did was wrong, terribly wrong, but there's a reason why what happened, happened." Martha stepped closer to the cell, maintaining a careful distance. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "What reason could possibly justify your actions?" Terry's shoulders sagged as he looked at her through the bars, his face a mixture of shame and something else, something that looked almost like pain. "What reason?" Martha repeated, her voice stronger now. Terry's composure crumbled completely as tears began streaming down his face. His hands trembled against the metal bars as he struggled to speak through his sobs. "My wife," he choked out, his voice breaking. "She's been cheating on me for 3 months. I found out but couldn't bring myself to confront her." His shoulders shook as he continued. "She's also black, and I just broke inside. The pain, the betrayal, it twisted something in me." James maintained his stern expression, though his jaw tightened slightly. "That's still no excuse for assaulting my wife," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his anger. "Depression doesn't justify violence." I know," Terry responded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I'm so alone, so devastated. Everything fell apart and I started hating everyone who reminded me of her. I built this wall of hatred because I couldn't handle the pain." His words dissolved into more sobbing. Martha's expression softened slightly as she listened. She stepped closer to the cell, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand the pain of betrayal more than you might think," she said quietly. "My mother cheated on my father. The stress and heartbreak triggered a heart attack and we lost him." She paused, taking a deep breath. "It destroyed our family, but hatred only breeds more pain." Terry looked up at her, his eyes red and swollen. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I took my pain out on you, and that was unforgivable." "You're right. It was unforgivable," Martha agreed. "But holding on to anger won't heal either of us." She turned to James, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and admiration. "I think we can show some compassion here." James's expression remained stern, but he nodded slowly. "If that's what you want, Martha." Martha faced Terry again. "We won't press charges," she said. "But you need help, Dr. Harold. Real help to deal with your pain and prejudices." "Thank you," Terry breathed, relief washing over his tear-stained face. "Thank you both. I don't deserve your kindness." James stepped forward, his voice firm but no longer angry. "No, you don't. But Martha's right. More hatred won't solve anything." They spoke briefly with Detective Sanders about dropping the charges, completing the necessary paperwork. As they prepared to leave, they watched as Terry was processed for release, his shoulders still slumped, but his expression showing genuine gratitude. Soon after, Terry was escorted into his driveway, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow that did nothing to ease the coldness inside him. As he entered, Tara emerged from the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, concern etched across her face. "Where have you been?" she asked, wringing her hands. "I've been worried sick." Terry dropped his keys on the side table with a clatter. "You won't believe what happened," he said, shaking his head. "I got arrested because of this black nurse at the hospital." Tara's eyes widened. "Arrested? What happened?" "She'd been flirting with me for days," Terry lied, his voice taking on an injured tone. "Today she wouldn't leave me alone and I lost my temper. I slapped her." He watched Tara's reaction carefully, adding quickly, "She went straight to the police, making up all sorts of stories." "Oh, Terry," Tara said softly, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch made him feel even more guilty about his earlier lies at the police station, but he pushed the feeling aside. "I understand you were frustrated, but slapping someone—" "It's all sorted now," Terry interrupted, not wanting to dwell on the details. He deliberately left out his fabricated story about having a cheating black wife, knowing it would unravel everything. The charges were dropped. Tara moved to sit on their leather couch, patting the space beside her. "I'm glad it's resolved, but honey, you need to control your anger better. Violence is never the answer, no matter how frustrated you get." Terry's face darkened. He remained standing, looming over her. "Are you on my side or their side?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I just spent hours in jail because of that woman, and you're lecturing me?" "I'm always on your side," Tara said quietly, hurt evident in her voice. "But that doesn't mean I have to agree with everything you do." "Just shut up about it," Terry growled, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "You don't understand anything." Tara stood slowly, her shoulders slumping in disappointment. Without another word, she turned and walked toward their bedroom, leaving Terry alone with his web of lies. The sound of their bedroom door closing softly behind her echoed through the silent house. The next morning, Terry arrived at the hospital early, his shoulders tense as he walked through the familiar corridors. The events of the previous day weighed heavily on him, though not for the reasons others might think. He settled into his office, arranging papers on his desk when a soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Martha stood in the doorway, her presence commanding respect despite her gentle demeanor. "May I come in, Dr. Harold?" Terry nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting striped shadows across the room. "I wanted to check on you," Martha said, smoothing her pristine white uniform as she sat down. "Yesterday was intense for everyone involved." Terry's face crumpled into what he hoped was a convincing display of remorse. "I'm so sorry, Martha. What I did was inexcusable." He paused, running his hands over his face. "The situation with my wife has been eating me up inside." Martha leaned forward slightly, compassion evident in her eyes. "About that, I think you need to confront Tara about the cheating. Living with that kind of pain, letting it fester, it's not healthy. It's clearly affecting your judgment and behavior." Terry felt a twinge of guilt at manipulating her kindness, but he maintained his act. "You're right," he said, his voice deliberately shaky. "I've been avoiding the conversation, hoping things would somehow fix themselves." "They rarely do," Martha replied softly. "Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need most. Have you considered couples counseling?" Terry shook his head, staring down at his hands. "I haven't thought that far ahead. I'm still trying to process everything." "Well, you don't have to face this alone," Martha said, her genuine concern making Terry's deception feel even heavier. The hospital has resources available if you need support during this time. Thank you, Terry managed, forcing his voice to crack slightly. Your support means more than you know, especially after how I treated you. Martha stood up, straightening her uniform. Just remember, Dr. Harold, healing starts with honesty, both with yourself and others. Terry nodded, maintaining his facade of a broken man. I appreciate your wisdom. Thank you for being so understanding. As Martha left his office, Terry watched her go, feeling a mix of relief that his lie had worked and discomfort at her genuine attempt to help. He turned to look out his window, knowing he'd have to maintain this charade of a troubled marriage for a while longer. Several days passed since Martha's visit to Terry's office. The hospital routine continued as usual, with Terry maintaining his careful facade of a troubled man dealing with marital problems. On a sunny Wednesday afternoon, Tara Harold made her way through the hospital corridors, carrying a carefully packed container of homemade food. She had spent the morning preparing Terry's favorite dishes, grilled chicken with roasted vegetables and his preferred pasta salad. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she approached his office, a gentle smile playing on her lips as she anticipated surprising him. The door to Terry's office was partially open. Tara knocked softly before pushing it wider. "Honey, I brought you lunch," she said, holding up the container. Terry's head snapped up from his paperwork, his face registering shock before quickly morphing into barely contained anger. The pen in his hand dropped to the desk with a clatter. "Tara? What are you doing here?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet of the office. "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch," she replied, her smile faltering at his hostile reaction. "I made your favorites." Terry stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "You can't just show up here unannounced. This is my workplace, not our kitchen." Tara's hands tightened around the container. "I don't understand. I've visited you at work before." "Things are different now," Terry snapped, glancing nervously at the door. "Don't ever come here without asking again. Do you understand?" The hurt in Tara's eyes was evident as she stood there, the carefully prepared meal suddenly feeling heavy in her hands. "Terry, what's going on with you lately? You've been so distant, so angry." "Nothing's going on," he said tersely, walking around his desk. "Just go home, Tara. I have patients to see." "But the food—" "Leave it if you want, but you need to go. Now." His tone left no room for argument. Tara placed the container on his desk, her movements slow and deliberate. She searched her husband's face for any sign of the warm man she'd married, but found only cold dismissal. Her chest felt tight as she turned to leave, confusion and hurt warring in her mind. As she reached the door, she paused. "You know, Terry, I just wanted to do something nice for my husband. I didn't realize that was such a terrible thing." Terry remained silent, his jaw clenched as he watched her leave. Once she was gone, he slumped into his chair, running his hands through his hair in frustration. The container of food sat untouched on his desk, a reminder of the web of lies he'd woven himself into. As Tara walked down the hospital corridor, her heels echoing against the sterile floors, she spotted Martha at the nurse's station, reviewing some patient charts. Something inside her snapped. The hurt and confusion from Terry's rejection transformed into misdirected anger. Martha looked up from her paperwork, sensing someone approaching. Before she could speak, Tara stepped directly in front of her, arms crossed. "I want you to stay away from my husband," Tara said, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Find someone else to flirt with." Martha's eyebrows drew together in confusion as she studied the unfamiliar woman before her. "I'm sorry, but I don't know who you're talking about. Who are you?" "Don't play innocent," Tara continued, her voice rising slightly. "I know all about how you've been throwing yourself at Terry. He told me everything about your inappropriate behavior." Martha's confusion deepened, her hand still holding the pen she'd been writing with. The accusation was so unexpected that for a moment, she could only stare at the agitated woman in front of her. "I really don't understand," Martha said calmly, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the bizarre confrontation. "Who exactly is your husband?" "Dr. Terry Harold," Tara replied, her eyes narrowing. "And I know what kind of trouble you tried to cause him. He told me all about how you tried to flirt with him, how you made him so uncomfortable that he had to defend himself." Martha's eyes widened slightly as the pieces clicked into place. This was Terry's wife, the supposedly black woman he'd claimed was cheating on him, the woman he'd used as an excuse for his deplorable behavior. Yet here she stood, very much white and clearly fed a completely different version of events. "Who are you even talking about?" Martha repeated, keeping her voice steady despite the revelation unfolding before her. She knew she needed to tread carefully with this situation, especially given how many lies Terry had already told. The tension in the corridor was palpable, as other staff members tried to appear busy while stealing glances at the confrontation. The stark contrast between Tara's obvious distress and Martha's composed confusion created an uncomfortable atmosphere that seemed to stretch endlessly. Martha took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of what she needed to reveal. "Mrs. Harold, I think you need to know the truth about your husband." Tara's defensive posture faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "Your husband was recently involved in an incident here at the hospital," Martha explained carefully, keeping her voice low and gentle. "He physically assaulted me, and when he was taken to the police station, he told my husband and me a very different story than what he's apparently told you." Tara's face paled. What are you talking about?" "Mrs. Harold, your husband told us, in front of the police, that he was struggling because his wife, who he claimed was black, had been cheating on him for 3 months. He said this was why he had developed prejudices against black people, leading to the incident with me." Tara's hands began to shake as she processed this information. She took an unsteady step backward, her earlier anger completely dissolved. "But I'm not, and I've never—" "I can see that," Martha said softly. "You're not black, and based on your reaction, I'm guessing you haven't been unfaithful either." Tears welled up in Tara's eyes as the implications of this revelation hit her. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she whispered, though the tremor in her voice suggested she already suspected Martha was being honest. "We have video footage of the incident at the hospital," Martha replied. "And there are police records of his statement. The ward boy, Ron, was also present for part of it. I can show you everything if you'd like." Tara's legs felt weak and she leaned against the wall for support. He told me you were trying to flirt with him. That's why he got in trouble. He said you were making advances." Martha shook her head sadly. "I'm married to James Brown, the owner of this hospital. Your husband didn't know that when he assaulted me, but he certainly knew it when he made up that story to tell you." The color drained completely from Tara's face. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to see this proof. I need to know the truth." Martha nodded sympathetically. "Of course, let's go somewhere private where we can talk and I'll show you everything." Martha quickly pulled out her phone and dialed Detective Sarah Chen's number. Within minutes, the detective agreed to come to the hospital to help clear things up. While they waited in a private consultation room, Martha could see the pain etched across Tara's face. The doctor's wife sat rigid in her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to maintain her composure. When Detective Chen arrived, she carried a thick manila folder containing the case files. Her professional demeanor softened slightly as she took in Tara's distressed state. "Mrs. Harold," the detective began gently, "I was the officer who handled your husband's case. I need to share some information with you about the statements he made while in custody." Tara nodded stiffly, preparing herself for what was to come. Detective Chen opened the folder and began reading from her notes. "On that day, your husband claimed that his actions toward Mrs. Brown were triggered by emotional distress. Specifically, he stated that his black wife, and I quote directly from the transcript, had been cheating on him for 3 months. He said this infidelity had caused him to develop prejudices against people of color." Tara's face crumpled. "But I'm not. We've been married for 8 years and I've never—" "We know," Martha said softly. "That's why we needed you to hear this." Detective Chen continued. He used this fabricated story to gain sympathy and avoid charges. The evidence suggests he deliberately crafted this narrative to exploit racial tensions and paint himself as a victim. Tears streamed down Tara's cheeks as she listened to the detective detail how Terry had manipulated the situation. "And then he came home and told me Martha was the one at fault," she whispered. "He used me, my being white, to cover up what he did." "I'm so sorry," Martha said, reaching out to touch Tara's hand. "Both for what happened and for having to be the one to tell you this." Tara suddenly turned to Martha, her eyes filled with shame. "And I came at you so aggressively earlier. I accused you of things that never happened, all because I believed his lies. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Brown. I can't believe I spoke to you that way." "Please call me Martha," she replied warmly, "and you don't need to apologize. You were acting on what you believed was true. Your husband manipulated everyone in this situation." Detective Chen closed her folder. "Mrs. Harold, you should know that your husband's actions constitute not only assault, but also making false statements to law enforcement. These are serious offenses." Tara wiped her eyes, her posture straightening as anger began to replace her shock and grief. "He used my race as a shield for his actions. He made up horrible lies about infidelity that never happened, and he made me complicit in his deception without my knowledge." Martha and Detective Chen exchanged glances as Tara processed the full scope of her husband's betrayal. The truth had finally come to light, revealing not just Terry's racism but his willingness to manipulate and deceive everyone around him, including his own wife. Tara stood up from her chair, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I cannot love a man who has stooped this low," she declared, looking at Martha with tears in her eyes. "I would understand if you fire him. I need time to process this, so I'm going now." Before anyone could respond, Tara hurried out of the room, her heels clicking against the hospital floor as she disappeared down the hallway. Martha watched her go, her heart heavy with sympathy for the woman whose world had just been turned upside down. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and dialed James's number. "James, you need to hear this," Martha said when he answered. She quickly explained everything that had just transpired: Terry's elaborate lie about having a black wife, his manipulation of the situation, and how he had used his actual wife's race as part of his deception. "I'm coming in 5 minutes," James responded firmly. "I'm just wrapping up a board meeting." True to his word, James arrived at the hospital shortly after, still wearing his formal business suit. His face was tense with anger as he joined Martha in the consultation room. She could see the concern in his eyes as he took her hand. "I've already called Detective Chen," Martha told him. "She's on her way back." They didn't have to wait long. Detective Chen returned, this time with additional documentation. The three of them sat around the small table, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily in the air. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," James said, his voice controlled, but filled with underlying anger. "Dr. Harold not only assaulted my wife, but then created an elaborate lie about having a black wife who cheated on him to avoid consequences?" Detective Chen nodded, spreading out several papers on the table. "That's correct, Mr. Brown. We have his false statement recorded and documented. He claimed his actions were driven by emotional distress over his supposedly unfaithful black wife, when in reality, Mrs. Harold is white and completely innocent of any wrongdoing. And now his wife knows everything," Martha added softly. She was devastated when she learned the truth. James shook his head in disbelief. He didn't just show racism and violence. He deliberately crafted a story that played on racial stereotypes and used his own wife's race as a shield. This goes beyond what we initially thought. Detective Chen pulled out a fresh form from her briefcase. "Given this new information about his false statements to law enforcement, would you like to proceed with pressing charges?" Martha and James exchanged a meaningful look. The situation had evolved far beyond a simple case of workplace harassment. Terry's actions had revealed a pattern of manipulation and deceit that needed to be addressed. Detective Chen strode purposefully through the hospital corridors, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Their footsteps echoed against the sterile walls as they made their way to Dr. Terry Harold's office. Martha and James followed close behind, maintaining a respectful distance. Terry was reviewing patient files when the group entered his office. He looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion as he registered the presence of law enforcement. Dr. Terry Harold? Detective Chen's voice was firm and professional. Yes, that's me, Terry replied, standing up from his desk. What's this about? You're under arrest for making false statements to law enforcement and obstruction of justice. Detective Chen moved forward while one of the officers produced handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the small office as they were secured around Terry's wrists. His face drained of color, and his usual confident demeanor crumbled. What? This is ridiculous, Terry sputtered, looking wildly around the room. His eyes landed on Martha and James, who stood silently in the doorway. What's happening? You can't do this. The second officer began gathering Terry's personal belongings while Detective Chen continued reading him his rights. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Terry's protests grew more desperate as the reality of the situation sank in. This is a mistake. I haven't done anything wrong. His voice cracked with panic as the officers began leading him toward the door. Hospital staff stopped in their tracks, watching wide-eyed as their colleague was escorted through the corridors in handcuffs. Some whispered among themselves while others quickly looked away, pretending to be busy with their tasks. Martha and James remained still and silent, watching as Terry was led away. His desperate pleas echoed through the hallway, growing fainter as the distance between them increased. The man who had once strutted through these same corridors with such arrogance now shuffled forward in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. As they reached the hospital entrance, Terry made one last attempt to look back at Martha and James. His face was a mixture of confusion, fear, and dawning realization. The bright sunlight outside seemed to momentarily blind him as the officers guided him toward the waiting police car. The car door shut with a definitive thud, and Terry's muffled protests could still be heard through the window as the police vehicle pulled away from the curb. Martha and James watched from the hospital entrance as the car disappeared around the corner, its red and blue lights reflecting off the surrounding buildings. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the jail's visiting area as Terry sat waiting, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to his usually pristine appearance. When Tara entered, his face lit up with hope, but it quickly faded as he noticed the manila envelope in her hands and her stern expression. "Tara, honey, I can explain everything," Terry began, his voice trembling. "Save it." Tara's voice was ice cold as she sat down across from him at the metal table. She slid the envelope toward him. "These are divorce papers. I want you to sign them." Terry's hands shook as he opened the envelope. "Please, just listen to me. I was trying to protect us. Our marriage." "Protect us?" Tara's laugh was bitter. "By lying about me being black? By making up stories about me cheating on you?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "I talked to Martha and the detective. I know everything, Terry. Every single lie you told." Terry's face crumpled. "I was scared. I didn't want to go to jail. I just said what I thought would work." "You used me," Tara cut him off. "You used my race as a shield for your racism. You made up horrible lies about me to save yourself." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What kind of man does that to his wife?" "I love you," Terry pleaded, reaching for her hand across the table. Tara pulled back as if his touch might burn her. "No, you love yourself. That's all you've ever loved." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Sign the papers. Have your lawyer send them to mine." Terry watched helplessly as his wife walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. Before he could process what had happened, Martha appeared in the doorway. "I didn't expect to see you here," Terry said quietly, unable to meet her eyes. Martha sat down where Tara had been moments before. "I came to tell you something important." Her voice was calm but firm. "What you did wasn't just wrong, it was cruel. You hurt your wife, you hurt me, and you hurt yourself." Terry stared at the divorce papers in front of him. "I know." "Do you?" Martha's question hung in the air. "You lied about your wife's race. You made up stories about infidelity. You tried to destroy my reputation. And for what? To avoid taking responsibility for your actions?" Tears welled up in Terry's eyes. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "But it did," Martha replied. "And now look at where you are. Your wife is leaving you. Your medical license will probably be revoked. All because you couldn't see past the color of my skin." Terry's shoulders slumped as the weight of his actions pressed down on him. Martha stood up, gathering her purse. "Your hatred and lies didn't just hurt others, Dr. Harold. They destroyed everything you had." She paused at the door. "I hope you learn from this, but it's too late to fix what you've broken." Terry sat alone in the visiting room, the divorce papers before him, and the echo of 2 pairs of footsteps fading away, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his actions. The morning sun barely reached the narrow windows of the jail as Terry was escorted to his new assignment. The guard handed him a mop and bucket, his lip curled in obvious disgust. "You'll be cleaning the common areas today, Harold," the guard said, emphasizing his last name with mockery. "And remember, you're not a big-shot doctor anymore." Terry gripped the mop handle, his knuckles white. Other inmates, mostly men of color, watched him with knowing smirks as he began his work. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The formerly prestigious doctor now scrubbing floors alongside those he'd once considered beneath him. As he worked his way down the corridor, 2 inmates walked past, deliberately stepping on his freshly mopped floor. "Look at the racist doc," one sneered. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Terry kept his head down, focusing on the repetitive motion of the mop, but he couldn't block out the conversations around him. "Did you hear what he did?" a guard whispered to another. "Made up lies about his own wife being black just to get out of trouble. What kind of man does that?" "Pathetic," the other guard replied. "Even the drug dealers have more integrity than that." The words stung more than Terry expected. He moved to the cafeteria, where he was assigned to wipe down tables. As he worked, he overheard more conversations. "That's the doctor who slapped the black nurse," an inmate told his companion. "Then tried to blame it all on his wife. Man's got no honor." "At least when I got locked up, I owned what I did," another replied. "Didn't try to throw my family under the bus." Terry's hands trembled as he wiped the tables. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every contemptuous smile, they all reminded him of how he used to treat others. Now he was the one being looked down upon, not for the color of his skin, but for the content of his character. During lunch break, no one would sit near him. Even the other white inmates kept their distance, disgusted by his actions. He ate alone, feeling the weight of dozens of judgmental eyes. By late afternoon, his back ached from the physical labor he wasn't used to. His hands were raw from cleaning chemicals, and his feet throbbed in the cheap prison shoes. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional toll. As a guard led him back to his cell, he heard one final conversation between 2 officers. "Can you believe that guy was a doctor treating patients? Shows you can have all the education in the world and still be trash." In his cell, Terry sank onto his thin mattress, his body and spirit exhausted. For the first time, he truly understood what it felt like to be judged, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than human. The realization brought no comfort, only shame as he recognized his own face in the mirror of contempt others now held up to him. Martha sat at a quiet corner table in the local coffee shop, her hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. Through the window, she watched as Tara approached, her shoulders slightly hunched, looking smaller than she had in the hospital. When their eyes met, Martha offered a gentle smile and waved her over. "Thank you for meeting me," Martha said as Tara settled into the chair across from her. "I ordered you a cappuccino. I hope that's okay." Tara nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the napkin in front of her. "It's perfect, thank you. I wasn't sure about coming, but I needed someone to talk to who understands." "I know exactly what you mean," Martha replied softly. "Sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us the most." Tears welled up in Tara's eyes. "I keep thinking about all the lies. Not just the big ones about you and at the police station, but all the little ones too. How many times did he come home late and make up excuses? How many times did he twist the truth?" Martha reached across the table and squeezed Tara's hand. "It's not your fault. Terry, he has a way of making others feel small to make himself feel big. I saw it firsthand in the hospital." "Can you tell me?" Tara asked, wiping her eyes. About what really happened that day? Martha took a deep breath and shared her experience, the surgery, the slap, the harassment. As she spoke, she watched understanding dawn in Tara's eyes. I felt so helpless in that moment, Martha admitted, but I refused to let his actions define me or break my spirit. How did you stay so strong? Tara's voice was barely above a whisper. I remembered that his actions reflected on him, not on me, and I had people in my corner who loved me. My husband, my colleagues. You have people in your corner too, Tara, including me. Tara took a shaky sip of her coffee. Sometimes I feel so foolish for not seeing it sooner. The racism, the cruelty. Was I blind? No, Martha said firmly. You saw the person he pretended to be. That's not your fault. What matters is what you're doing now. Choosing truth over comfort, choosing what's right over what's easy. I never thought I'd find understanding from someone my husband hurt, Tara said, managing a small smile. But here you are, showing me more kindness than he ever did. That's because hate doesn't win, Martha replied. Compassion does. And you deserve compassion, Tara. You deserve peace. As they finished their coffee, both women felt lighter, as if sharing their burdens had somehow made them easier to bear. They stood to leave, and Tara surprised Martha with a heartfelt hug. Thank you, Tara whispered, for showing me what real strength looks like. Martha hugged her back. We're both stronger than we knew, and we're both going to be just fine. They parted ways outside the coffee shop, each woman standing taller than when they'd arrived, united in their triumph over cruelty and their shared path toward healing. Terry's days in prison had fallen into a monotonous rhythm of degradation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he scrubbed toilets, his knuckles raw from the harsh chemicals. Other inmates purposefully tracked mud across floors he'd just mopped, snickering as they passed. Look at the fancy doctor now, one of the guards taunted, watching Terry struggle with a particularly stubborn stain. Not so high and mighty when you're down on your knees, are you? During mealtimes, he sat alone. The other inmates would whisper and point, their contempt evident in every gesture. Even the kitchen staff served him smaller portions, making sure his food was cold by the time it reached his tray. You're lucky you're in here, a burly inmate told him one day. Out there, people like you deserve worse. One afternoon, while Terry was assigned to clean the prison's medical wing, he encountered a familiar face that made his stomach drop. Mr. Johnson, an elderly black man he'd treated months ago, was there for his regular dialysis appointment. Terry had dismissed the man's concerns about his medication, treating him with barely concealed disdain. Mr. Johnson's eyes widened with recognition. Well, if it isn't Dr. Harold, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I read about what you did in the papers. Terry kept his head down, trying to focus on his mopping. You know, Doctor, Mr. Johnson continued, when you treated me like I was nothing, I prayed for you. Prayed that someday you'd learn what it feels like to be on the receiving end of such cruelty. Looks like those prayers were answered, though not in the way I expected. The words hit Terry like physical blows. He couldn't meet Mr. Johnson's eyes. I don't take pleasure in seeing anyone fall, Mr. Johnson added, but you brought this on yourself. All that education, all that privilege, and you couldn't see past the color of people's skin. What a waste. Later that night, lying on his thin prison mattress, Terry stared at the ceiling. The conversation with Mr. Johnson played over and over in his mind. His thoughts drifted to Martha, to his ex-wife Tara, to all the people he'd hurt with his lies and prejudice. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his actions pressing down on him. His medical license revoked, his marriage destroyed, his reputation in tatters, all because he couldn't let go of his hatred. A part of him wanted to blame others. Martha for exposing him, Tara for leaving him, society for punishing him. But another voice, growing stronger each day, whispered that he had no one to blame but himself. Still, his pride fought against these realizations. He tossed and turned, torn between acknowledging his wrongs and clinging to the superiority that had defined him for so long. The cell walls seemed to close in around him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen from his position of respect and authority. In the darkness, Terry wrestled with the possibility that everything he'd believed about himself and others had been wrong. The thought terrified him more than any physical discomfort or social isolation he'd endured in prison. His ego, though bruised, continued to resist the pull toward genuine remorse. The early morning sun filtered through the hospital windows as Tara walked through the familiar corridors, this time not as Dr. Harold's wife, but as herself. Just Tara, hospital volunteer. Her navy blue volunteer vest felt different from her usual designer clothes, but somehow more authentic. "Good morning, Tara," Martha's warm voice called out from the nurse's station. "Ready for another day?" Tara smiled, adjusting her volunteer badge. "As ready as I'll ever be, though I'm still learning where everything is." "You're doing great," Martha assured her, gathering some patient charts. "Would you like to help me with morning rounds? We could use an extra hand distributing breakfast trays." As they worked together, Tara observed Martha's interactions with patients. Each person received the same level of attention and care, regardless of their background. An elderly man struggling with his water pitcher got immediate assistance. A nervous teenage girl received gentle reassurance before a procedure. "You make it look so easy," Tara commented as they restocked supplies. "Connecting with people, I mean." Martha paused, considering her words. "It's not always easy, but everyone deserves dignity and kindness, especially when they're vulnerable." During lunch break, Tara joined a small group of volunteers and staff in the hospital cafeteria. The conversation flowed naturally, filled with laughter and shared stories. It was refreshing to be part of a community where she could just be herself. "Martha's been such a blessing," said Sarah, another volunteer. "When my mother was here last month, Martha stayed past her shift just to make sure she was comfortable." Tara watched Martha across the cafeteria, efficiently handling an unexpected situation with a distressed family member. Despite everything Terry had put her through, Martha remained professional and compassionate. There was no trace of bitterness or resentment in her work. Later that afternoon, Tara helped Martha organize a support group for patients' families. As she watched Martha create a safe space for people to share their fears and hopes, Tara felt something shift inside her. Here was a woman who had every right to be angry at the world, yet chose to channel her energy into helping others. "You know," Tara said as they cleaned up after the session, "I used to think strength meant never showing weakness, but watching you, I'm learning it's about something else entirely." Martha looked up from stacking chairs. "What do you mean?" "The way you handled everything with Terry, you didn't let it break you or make you bitter. Instead, you're here, making a difference in people's lives. That's real strength." A gentle smile crossed Martha's face. "Sometimes our hardest experiences can become stepping stones to help others. We just have to choose how to use them." Tara nodded, feeling a spark of inspiration. Perhaps her own painful experience could serve a greater purpose. She thought about all the other people who might be struggling with betrayal or trying to rebuild their lives after deception. Terry sat on the hard prison bench, his hands trembling as he held the official document. The words, "Restraining Order," glared back at him in bold black letters. His throat tightened as he read through the legal text. Tara had requested no contact within 500 feet. The finality of it struck him like a physical blow. "Harold, you've got mail," the guard announced, sliding a thick envelope through the bars. Inside were divorce papers, already signed by Tara. Her signature, once so familiar, now looked like the final nail in the coffin of his former life. Back in his cell, Terry pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. "Dear Tara," he started, then stopped. What could he possibly say? The words wouldn't come. He crumpled the paper and started again. "Tara, I know I made mistakes." He scratched it out furiously. Another attempt. "I never meant to hurt." The lie tasted bitter even as he wrote it. 5 more attempts followed, each one ending in the waste bin. His frustration mounted with each failed letter. The pen pressed harder into the paper, his handwriting becoming more aggressive. "If you would just listen," he wrote, then stopped himself. There was that anger again, that entitled sense that everyone else was wrong. He threw the pen across the cell. Sitting on his thin mattress, Terry stared at the concrete walls. The silence of the cell block at night was deafening. No more comfortable home to return to. No more respected position at the hospital. No more Tara waiting with dinner and a smile. He thought about Martha, about how his hatred had poisoned everything, about how his lies had spiraled out of control, about how Tara's face had looked when she discovered the truth, not just angry, but disappointed, disgusted. The realization hit him hard. He had done this. Not Martha, not Tara, not anyone else. His choices, his prejudices, his lies had brought him here. The comfortable narrative he'd built about being wronged crumbled in the face of this stark truth. Terry lay back on his bed, the restraining order papers crinkling in his pocket. He had no one left to call, no one to blame, no one to manipulate with his lies. Just four walls, a ceiling, and the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The hospital's conference room buzzed with excitement as staff members gathered for a special ceremony. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the space where Martha stood, her hands clasped together, a modest smile on her face. James, dressed in a crisp suit, approached the podium with pride in his eyes. Today, we recognize someone who has shown extraordinary strength, professionalism, and dignity in the face of adversity, James began, his voice warm and steady. Martha Brown has demonstrated what it means to stand up for what's right, while maintaining the highest standards of patient care. Martha felt her eyes grow misty as she watched her colleagues nodding in agreement. The certificate of commendation lay on the table before her, its gold seal catching the light. The words, "Excellence in Professional Conduct and Patient Care," were written in elegant script. One by one, her fellow nurses and doctors stepped forward to share their thoughts. Sarah from Pediatrics spoke about Martha's gentle way with children. Dr. Rodriguez recalled how she had handled a difficult emergency situation with remarkable composure. Even Ron, the ward boy who had helped expose Terry's actions, stood up to praise her integrity. "Martha showed us all what real strength looks like," Ron said, his voice full of respect. "She didn't let hatred win. She fought back with dignity." In the back of the room, Tara sat quietly, having become a regular volunteer at the hospital. Her presence reminded everyone how healing could come from the most unexpected places. She caught Martha's eye and gave her a warm smile. James handed Martha the microphone. She took a deep breath, smoothing her uniform with slightly trembling hands. "Thank you all," she began, her voice steady despite her emotion. "This recognition means more than I can say. But the real victory isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who stands up for what's right, who chooses compassion over hatred." The room erupted in applause. Martha looked around at the faces of her colleagues, people who had become more than just co-workers. They had become allies, supporters, and friends. The hospital, despite what had happened, felt more like home than ever. After the ceremony, staff members gathered around the refreshment table, sharing stories and congratulations. Martha found herself surrounded by well-wishers, each one expressing their admiration for how she had handled the situation with Terry. "You've inspired me to speak up about things I've seen," one young nurse confided. "Your courage made a difference for all of us." Martha squeezed her hand in response, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Not from Terry's downfall, but from knowing that her experience had helped others find their voice. The hospital had changed. There was a new openness, a stronger sense of community. James approached with a piece of cake, handing it to her with a proud smile. "You've made this hospital better," he said quietly. "Not just by standing up to prejudice, but by showing everyone how to do it with grace." Martha looked around the room one last time, taking in the scene. The certificate would hang in her office, not as a reminder of Terry's actions, but as a symbol of what could be achieved through patience, dignity, and unwavering professionalism. With Tara by her side as a new friend and the support of her colleagues, she felt ready to continue her work with renewed purpose. Terry's orange jumpsuit felt especially scratchy as he mopped the prison's common area floor. The steady rhythm of his work was interrupted by excited chatter from a group of inmates gathered around the daily newspaper. "Did you see this? That nurse who got that racist doctor locked up just got some big award," one inmate said, tapping the paper with his finger. Says here the whole hospital showed up to support her. Terry's hands tightened around the mop handle. He tried to appear focused on his task, but every word pierced through him like needles. Man, that Martha Brown really showed him, another prisoner chimed in. Says she handled everything with dignity and grace. Even his own wife sided with her in the end. The words echoed in Terry's mind as he mechanically pushed the mop across the floor. He had assumed Martha would crumble, that she was just another nurse he could bully. Instead, she had risen above his cruelty, earning respect and admiration while he rotted in prison. Later that evening, alone in his cell, Terry lay on his thin mattress, staring at the concrete ceiling. The image of Martha and Tara together haunted him. Two women he had wronged, finding strength in each other's company. His wife, who had once been his anchor to normalcy, now stood beside the very person he had tried to destroy. The thought of their friendship twisted like a knife in his gut. He remembered Tara's final visit, how she had looked at him with such disappointment before walking away forever. Now she had found a new support system, one built on truth and mutual respect. Everything their marriage had lacked. Darkness crept into his cell as evening approached. Terry rolled onto his side, facing the wall covered with tally marks from previous inmates. Each scratch represented days of confinement, just like the one stretching ahead of him. The weight of his actions pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. For the first time since his imprisonment, Terry felt something beyond anger and self-pity. Real shame washed over him as he recalled Martha's face when he had slapped her, the hurt in Tara's eyes when she discovered his lies. He had caused so much pain, all because of his own prejudices and insecurities. The realization brought unexpected tears to his eyes. He thought about writing letters to Martha, to Tara, to everyone he had wronged. But what could he possibly say? How could words on paper make up for the hatred he had spread? Would anyone even bother to read them? Terry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling the full weight of his isolation. His reputation, career, marriage, everything he had valued was gone, destroyed by his own actions. The truth he had been avoiding finally settled in his heart. He deserved this loneliness. If you enjoyed the story of Martha, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.